I intend to travel with all of you for the next hour or so on a journey through the transformations of the English language in the United States. I want to explore how is it that this language that we received from England became American English. How is it that it integrated itself into the country? What were the pros and cons, the triumphs and tragedies? What were the essential moments? And in what way this language of ours is an expression of our own character? Does it open up to others? Is it populist and popular? Is it truly democratic? Is it by the people and for the people? Or is it a language of the elite? How does that language get transformed over time? And I am especially interested in the capacity of that language to be both very local, with accents and with even dialects, and a global way of communication that is spoken all over the world. So I want to bring you together with me to the moment in which the settlers, the colonists, first arrived to these lands. And imagine the language that they were speaking. In what way is that language different than the one we use today? If we look at the letters, at the manifestos, and at the books composed in, for instance, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, we will find that many of the lexicographic elements have become almost obsolete today. There was no punctuation standardized at that time the way there is right now. There was a chaotic, even erratic strategy on making the syntax flow from one individual to another. One of the things that I do in the people's tongue is to reproduce some of that correspondence in some of those journals that were written by the first settlers. And my impression is that if any of them would come back to life right now, or any of us would travel back in time, we would discover that probably a half or 2/3 of the language that we use in today's time would be alien to them, and that the ways of communicating that they had are also strange and foreign to us. In order to create a nation, you need a series of elements. You need a land, you need a flag, you need a mythology, a common history. You need, of course, a population. Eventually, you will need a post office and schools and a centralized government. But on occasion, these elements might be absent. There are nations that don't have territories, for instance, and there are also, for that reason, without a government, or they have a government in exile, or a government that is itinerant, that moves from one place to another. One thing that you cannot avoid, one thing that is essential in the making of any nation and national narrative, is that you need a language, and sometimes more than one. As in the case of Canada, or as in the case of India. In the United States, prior to the arrival of these settlers, colonists, there were, it is estimated, around 200 different languages that were spoken here by the indigenous population. And if you count the entire North America and South America, the estimate is much larger. Linguistic historians suggest that there might have been up to 1,400 languages spoken in that fateful 1492, many of which, unfortunately, as we all know, tragically, have disappeared over time. And that is because the survival of languages is, much as many other things, connected with a Darwinian system, whereas wherein the stronger, the most powerful, manage to pass on and even to expand themselves, and the weakest links succumb to the elements. English is a language that already came with a big history prior to the arrival of the Mayflower. And that big history was ingrained in the DNA that we received from those travelers across the Atlantic. It is fascinating that in the moment of the revolution, when this country became independent, upon drafting the Constitution, the founding fathers were obviously communicating in English. English, for some of them, was more than simply a way of communication, was a source of pride. And yet, none of them managed, even though they thought about it, to establish that the language would be official for the entire country. And today we have English as an official language in some states of the Union, but not in the central constitution that we have, that is not in the federal government. What does it mean to have a country where everybody speaks one language, but that language is not official? What does it mean to have that category, that a noun that defines it as official, even though it is the meeting point where all of us find each other? It is symptomatic, and to me, just extraordinary, that two of the founding fathers debated the question of what would happen to the English language as time went by. It wasn't only a break with England that was taking place in their minds, but it was also a vision of where this country would go with that language, English, as a main feature of the character of this country. John Adams, our second president, suggested in a proposal that it would be good for the United States and for English in general to have the equivalent of an academy like the French had and like the Spanish had, the Académie Française in Paris and la Real Academia Española in Madrid. Those were institutions that had been established at the beginning of the 18th century in order to safeguard the national language of France and of Spain, and similar efforts had been done in Italy, in Germany, and in Portugal. It seemed that one of the efforts to distinguish yourself as a nation in that 19th century, in that 18th century, was that you needed to make sure that your own language would survive, needed to be protected, and that there would also be mechanisms like putting together a dictionary, like establishing certain rules that would make that language not deteriorate over time. John Adams was very adamant that if we didn't have an Academy of the English language, federally funded, that is, the government, the central government, would be in charge of protecting that language. Eventually, the language would go to the dogs. And if you think about it, it is an extraordinary statement because when compared to the vast majority of standardized languages in the world, and a standardized language means that it has a recognized grammar, a recognized syntax, an accepted vocabulary that passes from one generation to the next through these items that we call dictionaries. English is one of the only languages standardized that doesn't have such an institution. And it begs the question, do we benefit by not having an Académie Française of English or a Real Academia Española of English? Would it stifle the dynamic of how words are shaped, of who embraces them, of how they are accepted or rejected? In contrast with Adams, Thomas Jefferson, who was a veritable Renaissance man, passionate lover and defender of indigenous languages and other languages, who loved to explore, to analyze, and to write about grammar and syntax, believed that such an institution would do harm to the people of the United States and to the language itself, because a language needed to survive, in his view, by sheer natural effort. It would find its own strategies, it would create its own parameters, and eventually, if it managed to be victorious, it was because the people, in his view, would be the ones carrying it on. Fortunately, it was Jefferson who triumphed in this, who became the winner of this debate between how to protect the English language in the United States vis-a-vis Adams. We don't have such an institution, and we leave it to the weather, to the elements, to make sure that our language is ours. So one of the questions that I want you to ponder together with me is, how many words are there in the English language? Where do these words come from? How many new words are incorporated into the language every day, every week, every month? In what way? What is the process for a word to be accepted or to be rejected? And are there segments of the population that are more prone to create new words? It is frequently said that young people tend to be much more liberal in many dimensions of life, and also in relation to language, that young people will invent new words. Today, through social media, in regular interactions, you hear all sorts of combinations that might, to people that are older, feel uncomfortable, as if the words are just springing out of nowhere and are threatening those that are more established, whereas older people, more conservative, more connected with the purity and the continuity of the language, tend to protect the words rather than create new words. It is also the fact that in a country of immigrants like ours, a country where every single day, every single year, we have newcomers from other parts of the world, there is a relentless infusion of other languages that are descending on us all the time. Plus, after the 20th century, so-called the American century, American English is not only the property of Americans. American English is a global phenomenon. It is the most popular language in the world, but attention here, there are more native speakers to Chinese, be that Mandarin or Cantonese, than to English. However, there are more speakers of English than of those varieties of Chinese, because 3 out of every 5 English language speakers are non-native. And this showcases the pressure that many of you native speakers, I'm not one, I'm an immigrant from Mexico who came to this country in 1985, the pressure that native speakers have by virtue of the fact that there are more people who were not born into the language, who use the language all the time in other countries for business and for technology and for all sorts of transactions, but also tourists and simply for diplomatic efforts. English is, American English, the lingua franca of today, the way Greek was during the Greek Empire, and Latin during the Roman Empire, and French in the 17th and 18th century was the language spoken by the majority of people, at least in Europe and in the colonies. And prior to that, Spanish. English is an imperial language. English is a colonial language. And that means that just like we were invaded, we received the language from the matrix, the motherland, England, English from America is also exported all the time through Hollywood and Netflix and Hulu and music and technology. And the language that we speak, the vocabulary that I am right now using for you to understand, is not only honed, it's not only polished by the 335 million Americans that live in this country, but by the many people that use American English as either the default or the primary way of communication. It was in 1828 when one of the lesser known founding fathers, Noah Webster, decided to put together for the very first time a dictionary of American English. Now, today we have plenty of dictionaries, sometimes within the same company, sometimes from different companies, yet he was the very first one who believed that in order for the nation to have an authority, we needed to follow what John Adams was suggesting, having an institution federally funded that would protect the language. What we needed, though, was a dictionary that would reflect the way Americans speak the language and the way that Americans pass that language to the next generations. And I want to briefly stop here to open up 2 or 3 more questions for you. All this related to this delicious, fascinating artifacts, items that I have an obsession with. I have a big collection in the upper floor of my house that is dictionaries. It's a fact that dictionaries are the centripetal force that enable us to corral the words in between covers. Think of the quixotic effort that a dictionary is. Somebody at some point decides to put in between those 2 covers every single word that people use in that language. There is no such thing as an unabridged dictionary. All dictionaries are abridged because the moment you publish it, at least in printed form, there will be immediately words that are out of that dictionary that are being used by many people that are new and that are making that dictionary already obsolete. A statement of the time and space in which it was born, but also of the ineffability of how language rapidly progresses. Noah Webster, and there are 2 types of dictionaries. I mean, there are many types of dictionaries, as many of you know. There are bilingual dictionaries. Actually, there are multilingual dictionaries. There used to be much more. Dictionaries that are in 5 languages or in 8 languages. There are dictionaries of sports. There are dictionaries of medical terms. There are dictionaries of technological terms or of business. There are, in certain parts of the world, local and dictionaries that refer to localisms. There are also dictionaries of sexual parts, of flora or fauna. The possibilities really are infinite. There are, at the same time, other ways to define and catalog dictionaries. One is that there are dictionaries that are historical, that is, dictionaries that retain the words that have been included in them. They will never expel those words out. They will keep them as a kind of treasure box of the memory of the people that use that language. And you can go to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, and see how the word gay, G-A-Y, has been used. When was the first time it was uttered? The definitions, quotations from different moments in Shakespeare, in Milton, in Dickens, in James Baldwin, and thus you are able to follow through a particular word the journey that that concept has gone through over time. The OED doesn't expel, doesn't exile words. It keeps them in order to create a record of how the language has expanded. And it is said that the OED has almost 1.5 different words that are included, might be now even closer to 2 million. That is not that the OED has only 2 million words, but that has 2 million different words that are contained in it. And there are the other dictionaries that are contemporaries, that only try to reflect the way the language is spoken at a particular time, say right now. And the words that are no longer in use are taken out. There are two other ways to divide dictionaries. One is that dictionaries can be prescriptive. They prescribe how people should use the language, and dictionaries that are descriptive. The dictionaries in Spain, for instance, the dictionary of the Real Academia Española, the Royal Academy of the Spanish Language, is a prescriptive dictionary. It tells people what words are accepted and words that the folks, that the scholars of the academy don't deem valuable or durable enough to be part of the dictionary, they will not include them. They legislate what word is accepted and what word is rejected. Those are the prescriptive dictionaries. But the majority of the dictionaries in the English language are descriptive. They don't tell people how to speak. It is people who tell dictionaries what to include in them. Dictionaries are always being renewed. Dictionaries tend to die very fast if they are not renewed, if they are not fed with new words. The moment a dictionary is published, if there's no next generation to be feeding it with new terms in a new edition coming out, that dictionary will be only a statement of the moment in which it was published and will become a fossil. It will become obsolete. The dictionary of Merriam-Webster is a dictionary that is descriptive, that is incorporating words all the time. And in my conversations with the editor at large and with other staff members, I frequently ask them, how is it that a word is canonized? How is it that it's accepted? And what is the fastest word ever to travel from people's tongue to the dictionary, to Merriam-Webster itself? And as of now, I am told the word COVID, as in the pandemic that we all just went through, is the word that went the fastest from the moment it was first uttered at the end of December 2019 to February of 2020, when it was heard all over. And by the beginning of March, the word was already inserted in the online edition of the dictionary. It might have been actually in February. And according to the record, that is, that a word for Merriam-Webster has to be heard in 3 different sites, disconnected from each other, by speakers that also don't know each other and have the same meaning. That word is the one that has traveled the fastest. That means, dear friends, that it takes now a matter of days for a new word to be recognized as a word, and for words to change meanings, because it is not only about inserting new words in the dictionary, it is also about redefining them. One of the most controversial efforts that the Merriam-Webster dictionary has been involved in, seems that the polemic is still going on, is a new definition for the noun they, given the gender and identity debates that we've been having as of late in this country. And I say very controversial because last year there were death threats to the staff of the dictionary in Springfield, Massachusetts, for including this new way of defining the word they by an individual who believed that was going too far, and the health and continuity of our language was being taken away by the woke staff of Merriam-Webster. I say all this because I often want to imagine the moment when Noah Webster sat down and said to himself, I need to create a dictionary in this beginning of the 19th century that will be a statement of what the American people use. And, you know, Noah Webster was incredibly punctilious, passionate about the language, and also not always very creative. Prior to him, in 1755, to me, the greatest lexicographer of all time, Samuel Johnson, known as Dr. Johnson, had published the magisterial A Dictionary of the English Language in England, in London, and he had done so alone, almost alone. He had a slave, incredibly bright, incredibly knowledgeable, who helped him, and he had a number of neighbors and friends who also supported his endeavor. But dictionaries in the 18th century and dictionaries in the 19th century were still efforts done by a single individual, just like Noah Webster. And this is in contrast with the fact that today a dictionary, in order to be finished, needs dozens and sometimes hundreds of staff members to evaluate, to harness, to collect all the words, to find the right definition, to test it against time, to make sure it is representative, so on and so forth. This didn't used to be the case. It used to be an individual, a quixotic effort, as Noah Webster made it. Noah Webster included in his first dictionary, again, the title is An American Dictionary of the English Language, many words that Johnson had included and plagiarized some of the definitions. But he also included many other words that were native to these lands and proposed a series of spellings, some of which took hold and we embraced, some others that were rejected over time. That dictionary in 1828 was the source of what we call today the Merriam-Webster dictionary. It was the Merriam brothers who realized the genius of Noah Webster and bought, not from him, but from his son-in-law, who had inherited and was collaborating with his father-in-law, all the database, we'll use a term today, to expand it and then turn it into a commercial endeavor. And this leads me to one more point. When compared to England, the OED is a scholarly endeavor based in Oxford University and paid as a nonprofit by scholarships and donations, so on and so forth. In contrast, Merriam-Webster, arguably the most important dictionary of the United States, is, I think fittingly, a commercial endeavor. They depend on ads. They depend on the sale of actual copies. They depend on who signs on to their webpage. And today they have many more users on the webpage than buyers of books on an annual basis. Think of it this way, dear friends. When Emma Lazarus wrote her sonnet, The New Colossus, to be eventually engraved in a plaque in the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, 1883, that famous statement within the sonnet that says, give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. This was the very first statement that supposedly immigrants from Italy, from Ireland, Jews coming from different parts of Europe would first see, first come upon. They were being greeted to this country where the mother of exiles was raising her arm with a torch, giving them allowance to go through the entrance door in English. Many of them didn't even know a certain word, and there was no effort whatsoever to have that sonnet translated into Italian or into Gaelic or into Yiddish, whatever the languages of those European immigrants were using when they arrived. English for a long time was the sink or swim language of this country. If you were an immigrant, again, like I am, you were told up until roughly 1950 that if you wanted to stay in this country, you needed to learn the language and sacrifice your language of immigration. This is the country where the English, the American English is spoken. You're welcome to be here as long as you join us in that big conversation that we all have with language. But something dramatic happened in the country in the early 60s, and it's called bilingual education. It is connected with kind of the aftermaths of that would be the English-only movement and English first. And that is that we slowly recognized that in the age of globalism, asking immigrants to give up their language as they embrace the English language is frankly somewhat foolish. They already have an astonishing asset with them. Why not allow them to keep that language? French, Creole, Spanish, Nahuatl, Quechua, the languages of Africa or Asia, as they arrive to the English language. What also has happened from the very beginning, but even more so from the 1960s to the present, is that we have minority languages in this country, such as Black English, also known sometimes pejoratively as Ebonics, or Spanglish, the mixing of Spanish and English, or Yinglish, Yiddish and English, or Chinglish, Chinese and English. Immigrant groups in the process of acquiring the English language often mix their immigrant language with the common mainstream language of the United States. And in doing so, they also borrow and lend words all the time. And so today, it's really a statement of the richness of both the immigrant waves that we have benefited from and of the global efforts of the English language, that there are dozens of words within English that come from Italian and that come from French and that come from Yiddish and that come from Chinese and many other languages. And I, again, going back to imagining those first settlers or the founding fathers, have the suspicion that if we needed to communicate with John Adams about the idea of still creating an academy for the protection of the English language, there would be dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of words that John Adams would not be able to understand. Think of words like pizza, microchip, cryptocurrency, laptop, all these words, airplane, iPhone, all these words that we take for granted every day, that are part of our language, that are constantly being renewed, refashioned, but that he would have no knowledge whatsoever about. But likewise, it would be with Shakespeare. If we went even farther in the past and across the Atlantic, Shakespeare, who was known to have produced about 2,000 different words invented that ended up in the English language. One of them, for instance, is the word lawyer. Would also not necessarily understand a lot of the things that we say, because the English language is incredibly picky, incredibly elastic, incredibly malleable. And in order to survive, it devours everything that is in front of it. And in devouring it, it also vomits all sorts of words and turns of sentence, in forms of speech that people incorporate into other languages. For instance, the Académie Française says explicitly that people should not use le weekend, because this is a statement of how American English is controlling or polluting the French language. And that type of resistance against the global imperial efforts of English are ubiquitous in every part of the world. I could say, when I wrap things up and open this to discussion, I go back to some of my central questions here. How is it that a language endures? You know, in the history of humankind, we have spoken between 30 and 40,000 different languages. And yet it feels today that we're becoming incredibly narrow in the multiplicity of languages, and that English, in all its versatility, in all its litigious qualities, it also eclipses, oppresses other languages to the point of erasing them. It is also a fact that within the English language, there are attempts of resistance. I believe that in the language, we can see the cemeteries that have been built of indigenous languages from all over this nation, of words. For instance, more than half of the states in this country have names that come from indigenous languages, but we don't have any more speakers for many of those languages. And for the ones that we do have, they are under threat, becoming extinct if we don't do something about them. There is also the fact that within certain groups, like Blacks, like Latinos, there is an effort to retain a minority language vis-a-vis the mainstream. I am especially interested in the explosive nature of Spanglish. Many Latinos, and there are 65 million of us in the United States, speak English, but have not abandoned the Spanish language, and yet don't use it in pure, uncontaminated ways. We have created something new called Spanglish that depends on code switching, and that enables us to be both Americans when we speak the English language and Latinos when we communicate in Spanglish with others that are like us. It's a dialect, it's a division of the language. There was a wonderful linguist, a Yiddish language linguist, Max Feinreich, who in the first half of the 20th century suggested that the difference between a dialect and a language is that a language has an army and a navy to defend it, but not a dialect. Spanglish doesn't have an army and a navy, doesn't have a flag, doesn't have a central government, and yet 65 million Latinos live in the United States, and many of them use this language, sometimes just to joke around, sometimes as a way of resistance within the larger society, the oppressiveness that the mainstream can project on certain minority groups. I conclude by asking, what is the future of American English? In what way, without an institution like an academy, will continue to exist? Is it a language that still benefits from all the immigrants that are coming in? Do we allow those immigrants to leave their trace in the language the way maybe we didn't want to, but they did in previous times? Is the globalism of the world such that the English language, as various and multifaceted within this country, is also so destructive that we, the people of the United States, need to do something in order to help other languages in other corners of the world survive as well and coexist with English? In what way, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, will our descendants speak the language that we will not be able to fully understand? Isn't that part of the Darwinian evolution, the pattern of acceptance, of rejection, of authorities that exist in a common way without any institution, us saying, this is the language this is the way we're going to speak this language, for better or worse. And should we accept that the words that we have received are jewels that contain the history of the past and that we are sending them into the future to be transformed, to be reconfigured in ways that might make us feel at some point obsolete? Thank you very much. Let's open this up to questions. Back to you, Johnny.
Thank you so much, Ilan. That's a lot to think about. And I do just want to remind folks once again that Ilan's new book, The People's Tongue, is available at Restless Books or also probably at a local bookstore. And the link to that is in the chat. So we have a few questions here already. The first one from Eileen is, at what point did American English become distinct from British English?
I would say, Eileen, that happened almost from the very beginning, when the settlers began to recognize that they were a new Canaan, a new version of the biblical Israelites that wanted to distinguish themselves from the persecuting forces that they had left behind. It is not as if from that moment on, they recognized that this was now American English and that it was different. But the spirit of newness, the spirit of distinction, the idea that they would not come here and then eventually go back, but create a new nation, gave them that sense of having a language that would be an expression of their own. And I would add to that, that in the interaction that they were having with the indigenous population, automatically that language started to incorporate all these very many aspects that they were finding in the environment. And it is the birth of the Americanness of the English language. Though if you want to make it official, probably it is the moment when Noah Webster publishes his dictionary, the first in this country, 1828, an American dictionary of the English language. Simply the word, an American dictionary of the English language, is a statement of fact. We no longer speak the English language, we speak an American variety of that language.
A question from Marcia, who's asking, how is the register of standard American English determined? Even though there isn't an academy, aren't there forces somewhere that protect the supremacy of one register or grammar or lexicon over others?
On a superficial level, Marcia, the first response to that would be, it is the pressure of how we all pronounce a word, how we accept that there is a standard pronunciation in the region that we live in, that forces others to embrace that version. So in Boston, the pronunciation of certain words would be different than the pronunciation in Montana or the pronunciation in Texas. Though the word will be the same, there will be pressure from the environment to recognize that that word is pronounced in particular ways. On the other hand, there is the enormous pressure that is coming from social media, and that in media in general. And that means, unlike previous times in history, that what we hear on television, what we hear on the radio, is not only about content, but it is about pronunciation. It is about standardizing the way we speak. And it's a fact of the dynamic of this country that the accents that come from the Northeast or from Southern California, that is New York and Washington and Connecticut and so on, and then LA and mainly through Hollywood, are the ones that are going to be projected nationwide. There are people in Montana, as you know, the Dakotas, the Carolinas, that will complain that we always need to follow the patterns that are being established by the elites. And those elites are not only at the level of education or level of government, but also at the level of pronunciation. But things change all the time. We also live at a moment of decentralizing forces when it comes to language. There are a lot of alternative media outlets that push different pronunciations. Young people are not exclusively in certain parts of the country, but are all over. And for better or worse, we have this system whereby we allow different political figures, entertainers, to come from different parts of the world, of the country, and eventually project those accents into their work. Think of Jimmy Carter, think of Obama, think of Donald Trump, and think of many Hollywood stars. The standardizing of pronunciation is very different than the standardizing of spelling in a dictionary. Though recently, I would say maybe 20 or 30 years now, maybe 20, a feature of Merriam-Webster is that you can go and hear how a word is pronounced by clicking on the icon. And that is something that dictionaries, obviously, before that didn't have. And sometimes the pronunciation that the dictionary will give you will also vary. But mostly it will be the one that the dictionary staff will have accepted as the standard and standardizing one. Again, based on where they are located and where the words were harvested.
There's so many great questions in here. I want to try and this feels a little bit like a brief follow-up to some of what you were just saying, just to, expand on, to Jamie's wondering, can you say something about class and language?
Yeah, Jamie, I appreciate that question enormously. There is, I think, an astonishingly vital element in the way language is shaped in this country when it connects to both class and ethnic and racial background. For better or worse, we have this mythical concept of the American dream, and that is that if you work hard and through education, you can ascend in the social and economic hierarchy. And that social mobility is something that doesn't happen everywhere in the world. In most places of the world, if you are born in the working class, you're likely to also die in the working class. And if you are part of an elite, an aristocracy, or a bourgeoisie, it is likely also that your children will be part of that, and then your grandchildren, and that your ancestors were as well, as century, 2 centuries. So what is beautiful about about American culture is that the ethnic groups connected with the lower strata of society, meaning the working class, and often people of color, are the ones that set the tone in fashion and also in language. Think about the way Blacks or Latinos dress in music, men with pants that are falling down, baseball caps turned around, long shirts, that eventually become a feature of the middle class through the fashion designers that steal from that group. And so something that was coming from the periphery of culture is now becoming mainstream. And in the United States, there is a constant hunger for newness. And the newness is defined by something that will come from the margins of society and eventually move to the center. The same thing happens with language. There are many words that have started through hip hop, through rap, gangster music, corridos, merengue, bachata, that were seen as working class terms, and eventually those in the middle class embrace those words and incorporate them into the dictionaries. So I would say the social mobility that takes place in this country is not only at the economic level, but certainly at the linguistic level. There are many words that have come from other parts of society that educated people will use. Let me give you one example. When I arrived to this country in the mid-80s, the word bad, B-A-D, meant not good. It was the age of Michael Jackson, and I was witnessing, the way everybody else was, how the word bad was becoming a statement of good. And that new definition had to do with a fashion musician who was renewing a certain term, recalibrating it, and then all of a sudden it spread like fire nationwide. So I think that it's very important to connect class, race, and ethnicity to the reconfiguration of American English all the time.
Again, there's so many great questions in here. Thank you for that. I guess you're just going to have to come back too, clearly. But I'll share a couple comments first. So Debbie is sort of answering the final question that you had asked and is saying, as an ESL, ELL teacher, I feel that we need to retain a basic grammatical format that immigrants can learn and grow with. But at the same time, we can accept modern vocabulary or slang or dialects that meet the needs of their speakers. And immigrants can pick up the new usage as their competence in English grows. And then another comment that I'll share, there's a question in there, but I think it's good to hear from Martha just saying that The People's Tongue is an absolutely glorious volume.
Oh, thank you.
I've been savoring it for weeks now. Appreciate it. And I guess for trying to find some of these questions that might, serve as good follow-ups, I guess a question here in the Q&A is, how would you anticipate the global dominance of American English shifting?
Yeah.
And if there were a significant shift in global power, say, for example, to China.
Excellent. Johnny, just remind me of the name of the person who was an ESL teacher.
That's Debbie Dorr.
Debbie, I want to acknowledge your statement, celebrate the work that you do, and express the fact that in the very way that you articulated your question, there is the very tension that define us all the time. How do we keep the language together? How do we protect it? And at the same time, offer ways for new people to join in with new words that don't break the language, don't destroy it, don't undermine the effort. I think that centrifugal and centripetal force that we all experience is something that nationwide and globally is felt as well. If we don't have anybody telling us that we can't use a particular word, but it is us, depending on each and every one, how we're using it, is it too chaotic, too, erratic an effort? We could say it is the teachers, it is the parents, it is the translators, it is the authorities, the lexicographers that are protecting that language. But how many people really pay attention to the lexicographers? The fact is that when you are making a living out there, you are not carrying a dictionary under your arm. you are speaking the language in whatever way. I think there's genius in the way American English functions for that reason, just as there is genius in American democracy in the sense that we might dislike very much others for the vision that they have about what government is, about abortion, about student loan, but we are in this business together, and we need to respect others the way others are supposed to respect us. And I think it happens also, that give and take with the English language. Some of us will protect it, others will push it in different directions. And it's that forcefulness, that tension, that eventually will push the language to the next step. How to look at the English language in the 21st century? Well, just as I mentioned, this is going back, Johnny, to the last question that you mentioned. The 20th century was the American century. In the 20th century, Du Bois said that it would be the color line that would define us, and indeed it was. The 21st century, I think it's the century of immigration, and it is a century that probably will not have the United States exclusively the center of power. Proof of that is already what we're seeing with China and with Russia. There are other competing imperial forces, and with them, other imperial colonial languages that want to establish themselves as the big guy in the block, the way English did a century ago. How long will English subsist? Look, languages are born, develop, rise, but languages also fall. There are languages that perish, and there are languages also that continue. There's revival of languages. Think of Hebrew for 2,000 years being frozen and then all of a sudden taken out of the refrigerator, and it's a new language for a very young country. I don't know where American English is going. I do know that there is much more competition now than before. There are many, many speakers of Chinese in the world. There are powers out there that want to test the durability of America and the durability of English. And this will have to force us to look for new strategies to coexist in the global habitat.